Hello there everyone. Had a good holiday, had a good new year. I hope your 2026 has started off nice and bright, mine certainly has. I'd like to start this video off by welcoming all new people who are here for the first time, as well as thanking anyone who came around during 2025. Your reviews, your replies, they mean a lot to me throughout last year. That goes for all the ones I agreed with and disagreed with. Agreeable opinions and replies give me insight on how my own takes stack up to the wider community, and disagreeable ones challenge me to stand on my own convictions. I have been known on some rare occasions to change my opinion on some topics, largely due to just audience response and new perspectives. Heck, I've even done videos as such. That said, I might not respond to every single one, but I am big on reading replies, and sometimes a comment is so provocative that I think to myself, wow, I kind of want to make a video on that subject. Now, I don't always follow through, it's normally just a thought, but today's case is different. Without burying the lead any further, let's get right into it. I was in the YouTube studio reading some missed comments to recent videos when one in particular caught my eye. Funny enough, it wasn't a reply to my most recent Hexerai video. It was a somewhat new response going back to my Imaginarium theater is fun, just misunderstood essay. All that video's context aside, as it's really irrelevant to understanding the comment, a user responded with the following regarding theater, which I'll put on screen. It's the same old sponge fighting under a clock in a circular arena. It's the Oscars of uninspired repetitive in-game content. Abyss, IT, Stygian, same horse different toppings. Now, the purpose of displaying this isn't to call anyone out or be confrontational. The name is pixelated. I'm sure you can find the comment if you want, but we're not here to bash or attack, and I'm going to request that no one does that. Again, I just want to discuss this assertion itself. As for why I felt this comment was so noteworthy, it's because honestly, it's not the first time I've heard similar. Genshin gets a lot of flack for being uninspired, and although the modes have different participation requirements, a common sentiment is that the game just throws you the same horse crap, with different toppings. But I believe that critique only applies if you're reducing all the modes down to raw gameplay, without consideration for different levers that define what each mode is testing. So strap in and get ready for a long one. I'm about to explain to you all the unique requisites of Abyss, Theater, and Stygian. 3 arenas, 3 purposes. All tests are not the same, but as this is a video game, we can at least point to 3 key facets: account status, knowledge, and skill, the trifecta of progress. Most gaming tests fall under one of these umbrellas, and deficiency in one neuters the others. You can have all the knowledge and mechanical skill in the world, but without an account of sufficient status, you won't have the power to pull through. You may have a deeply invested account and be excellent with buttons and timings, but if you don't have the knowledge to know what you're doing or what's optimal, then you'll just be throwing stuff to the wind. And you may have a spiffy account and know everything about how to play the game, but with poor execution and skill, not be able to translate it into clears. Though, to some degree, each can make up for a little lack in the others, but that said, if you're batting a 5 out of 10 in the skill department, you need to be batting an 8 or 9 in knowledge and status. These umbrellas break down into levers. In Genshin, knowledge is tested through understanding reactions, rotations, internalizing cooldowns, and team building. Skill is expressed through execution, dodging, aiming, rotating smoothly, and surviving under time limits. And status is put under pressure through character spread, elemental coverage, gear, account veterancy, account recency, and even monetary investment, which may be questionable on principle, but it is a testable status all the same. As you adjust these levers, be they umbrella levers or any combination of sub-levers that comprise them, you begin to see that said levers are what separate each in-game mode from one another and gives them unique identities. From there, we can solve higher abstractions, such as finding overlap, assigning purpose to each mode, or at the player's level, determining what a player lacks. So, let's just start with the Abyss. It's often said that the Spiral Abyss is the game's vertical investment test, especially when juxtaposed to Imaginarium Theater. What this typically means is that you have a few good teams which are highly invested in account status, character levels, gear, maybe even a constellation or two. Obviously, the more characters you have is the better, but a lower volume of quality characters will generally serve you better here than a higher volume of moderate characters. Indeed, in a vacuum of just Abyss and Theater, it absolutely holds true that the Spiral Abyss is Genshin's vertical investment test. But see, not in a vacuum, Stygian Onslaught exists, and in its higher echelons, you might actually want vertical investment comparable to Abyss's. Account status matters dramatically in Stygian, and if you truly take that mode to its extremes in dire difficulty, one could argue it's even more of a vertical investment test, especially if you accept the monetary lever as valid. To this end, maybe it's not so much that Spiral Abyss is Genshin's premier vertical investment test, as Stygian Onslaught also exists. Rather, maybe it's that Imaginarium Theater is the game's definitive horizontal test. You do want some well-invested characters in Theater as well, sure, but they don't have to all be perfect, and as well, its higher echelons don't ask quite as much for quality as quantity. I actually did a whole video on this concept, should be on your screen right now, go check it out after this vid if you haven't. And yet, I still consider Abyss to be a vertical test with its own identity from Stygian's vertical requirements. They may share a vertical lever when it comes to vertical versus horizontal, but that still doesn't mean that there aren't several other levers which separate them. It also doesn't mean there aren't levers that Abyss and Theater share with Stygian's exclusion, or whatever combination. And it's these various mixes of on and off switches which create the occasional overlap I mentioned earlier, while still allowing the modes to retain their identities in other ways. That's getting ahead though, we'll explore that later. Back to the Abyss, let's list some other levers and see some ways it compares and contrasts to the other modes, pick apart some things it exclusively does from them, and then we can build its identity beyond just being the game's vertical investment test. What are some defining features, rules, and levers from Spiral Abyss? Well, we already called it a vertical investment, that's cool. It also gives full range, full roster team building. All characters you own are available, even if a character isn't ideal on paper for the current challenge. That open roster lever is shared with Stygian Onslaught, but not with Theater, and yet, unlike Theater and Stygian, there's a very specific mechanic in Abyss and only Abyss when it comes to its reward structure. And that's the fact that it has no lockout mechanic to receive high marks. In Abyss, you can get 3 stars on a particular chamber, get 0 stars on the other chambers, and come back in later with completely different teams to get 3 stars on the chambers you missed previously. Without the need to 3-star a previously 3-star chamber again, mind you. Where Theater and Stygian differ is that in Theater, if you miss a Stella Flower, you must restart the challenge before moving on if you want to receive all Stella Flowers. They don't save over into a new run, unlike Stars in Abyss. Similarly, in the upper echelons of Stygian, if you change a character lineup or move a character to a different team, that challenge's time will reset, even if you've already cleared all 3 bosses. Although if you have already cleared all 3 bosses, it doesn't result in a demote of difficulty tier or anything, it just wipes your leaderboard time. But if you haven't cleared all 3 bosses yet, it's a commitment to wiping out one of your stages of progress. Abyss is unique in that unlike the other 2 modes, it has no commitment mechanic. In fact, as long as you can clear any stage on the floor to make it to whatever chamber you still need to 3-star, you can get all stars on a floor with 6 unique teams. This flexibility is a key part of Abyss's identity beyond just being a vertical investment test, which we'll get back around to in a second. But there is one more thing that comes to mind that's Abyss exclusive, and that is, it has no adjustable difficulty lever. Both Theater and Stygian do have adjustable opt-in difficulty levers, and this little detail is also super important for piecing together Abyss's identity. You can lower or raise the difficulty in the other modes, but there's one Abyss difficulty. As for what that implies, let's put that together with everything else we've picked apart about Spiral Abyss so far, build a profile of it, and then we can really get a better sense of exactly what it's doing and its purpose. Let's recap and lay it all out there. It is a vertical investment test centered around strong characters and good team building. The full roster is available, similar to Stygian but unlike Theater, and the highest marks do not have to be claimed in a single run. You can rebuild your teams in as many separate runs as you need to get the highest marks on a specific chamber, with the only requirement being that the team at least needs to be good enough to get you back to the chamber you didn't get a star on, but doesn't need to be able to gain previously gained stars again. Players can change around as they need to tackle challenges, but the challenges exist as is. Abyss's difficulty is locked, even if the roster technically is not, and even if clears are not locked to a single run. Put all together, what this all points to is that Abyss isn't just a vertical investment test. Abyss is testing your full ability to team build as you see fit. It's the in-game mode built around player agency when it comes to character selection, team building, and account status. There are conditional buffs and debuffs, and floors do often shill for the latest mechanic or character, but the freedom is still there. Because of this freedom though, there is one single difficulty for the Abyss, unlike Theater and Stygian, which more so lay out for you specific elements, characters, and or mechanics. Abyss sacrifices adjustability for agency, a flat challenge which at its core just asks players, do you have the knowledge, account status, and skill to beat this? Are you able to build viable enough teams with strong enough statuses? We're leaving it to you to do this, the ball is in your court. Here's the challenges, but you can't change anything about them, not even the difficulty. We've already conceded enough. Good luck, have fun. That's the Spiral Abyss. Testing your ability to put resources together from scratch. You can switch things up, you can try any infinite number of ways to tackle the mode. It's on you. The idea is they give you an explicit challenge. Now you use whatever you have at your disposal to clear it. Player agency, unmodifiable difficulty, infinite retries and angles, full roster, and of course verticality. Putting it all together, the Spiral Abyss can be summed up as the player agency test. Now that was saying a lot about the Spiral Abyss, but this discussion is about the differences between the modes and what they offer. Mechanically speaking, you may end up playing the exact same 4-character team across 2 or even all 3 modes. And that's a case of if it fits, and boils down to some of that overlap I mentioned before. But having some overlap, whether it's a team being viable in more than one mode, or a special reaction being shielded in more than one concurrently running mode, whatever the case, some overlap isn't indicative that the modes have no differences. And now that we've established Abyss as the player agency test, beyond reducing it to a vertical investment test, as we pick apart Imaginarium Theater, we'll actually begin to see even deeper differences than what's on the surface. Much in the same way Abyss isn't just a vertical investment test, Theater isn't solely a horizontal test, though that's what it is at its core. This section may or may not be as long as the Abyss section, but that's almost by logic. Now that we've set up a framework for the Abyss, a lot of structural comparisons for Theater can be bounced off of things we determined there. However, that's getting a little ahead of the game. let's just list some things that theater does, take a look at how those things form a bigger picture, and then similarly to how we found the Abyss to be the player agency test, find a suitable catch-all for theater. Sound good? Let's go. Unlike Abyss, Theater is explicitly not a full selectable roster team building test. Only characters across 3 element types and a few special outliers can be played. And even team building limits the agency of the players by making them draw characters from the already reduced cast of 3 elements. There are strategies for getting max marks, many of which I outlined in my Imaginarium Theater is Fun video, but without rehashing that entire discussion, most of the strategies for the mode have to do with reserved choices in gameplay as well as persistence. There's little in the way of choice agency. To the extent there is agency of choice, you look ahead to the highest stages and think to yourself what characters will be best for the job, so that you can attempt to collect a viable team for the ending before even getting there. Doesn't mean things work out like that though. There are selectable difficulties here though, allowing for a degree of player tailoring. On top of that, results are single run. There's no cleanup runs in Theater like the Abyss. Your highest stage and best marks must all be in the same run. Theater wants you to have a wide roster, but it doesn't call for them to be max level or built to the T. Importantly though, this is the part that's often left out by simply calling it the horizontal mode. It doesn't just want a wide roster, it wants a balanced roster. A distinction there, as a wide roster could be massively overloaded on characters of just 4 or 5 elements while neglecting the others. If Dendro is in the lineup, then having only 2 or 3 Dendro characters on your account probably isn't going to cut it for the good run. This is once again in contrast to Abyss, where having a wide roster is a plus, but if a floor is tailored to Dendro, then your 3 Dendro characters can be carried to every chamber. See, Theater is about coverage with layers, elemental coverage, and then enough characters within the elements to carry you through. That's what I mean by a balanced roster, as opposed to just a wide one. 13 Pyros, 13 Hydros, and 4 Dendros is 30 characters horizontal. So is 10 Pyros, 10 Hydros, and 10 Dendros, but players will likely find the 10-10-10 setup to be more manageable for a good run than the 13-13-4, especially when factoring in other categorizations. How many of those 4 are DPS characters? How many are sustain or support? Are any good Dendro applicators? In the highest echelons of the mode, you may find yourself running out of necessary Dendro characters before the final stages, and that could ruin the run if the final stages require Dendro characters. And yet, you were 30 characters deep, were you not? This manifests itself in some players finding some theater cycles to be manageable, while finding the very next month's cycle to be very hard. When the stars aligned and a player has balanced elements and roles, it works. When the stars misalign, suddenly it's, I don't have any good geo characters for this theater. It makes sense why theater has tiers of difficulty for this reason. This horizontal test is two-pronged. One is having enough characters and the other is having enough coverage. 2 different things. A player may technically find themselves able to participate in a certain tier, but practically speaking, not be able to. The difficulty selections allows players to dial it down to tailor it to their adequate balance of elements, healers, DPS characters, ranged characters, etc. All the categories that may serve as a make or break to passing. Abyss's whole point is player agency. They give you the challenge and you can do reruns how you like until you get it right, but they don't give you difficulty choices because that in itself is the test. Beat this test how you see fit. Theater, on the other hand, allows difficulty choices because it's not testing whether or not you can pass the trial based on your own ability to team build. Rather, Theater is testing whether or not they can throw all your parts in a random blender and you still come out on the other side victorious just on virtue of coverage. A benchmark tool, a gauging tool for how much coverage you really have. If you can't participate in a tier, you don't have enough concrete coverage. But even if you can participate in a tier, You may not have operational coverage across team roles or weapon types, etc. That said, the amount of characters needed to participate can't be acquired overnight by any means, and this is a huge point I made in my Imaginarium Theater is Fun video as well. Even a moderate spender cannot acquire new 5-star characters faster than they can come out or rerun, unless counting standard characters. There is a hard gate to how fast someone can gain that coverage as a result. This is compounded by the fact that most reruns these days favor characters who have been out in the past year or two. It's like I mentioned in that video, as a veteran player I have Ayaka, and while she's not the best character these days, for purposes of theater coverage, she's just a plus on my account, another cryo character. But a new player, even if they're willing to spend for Ayaka, where are they going to pick up that Ayaka other than a Chronicled Wish banner maybe? Older characters don't just rerun like that, you know what I mean? And as time moves forward, this becomes increasingly so. Once a Chronicled Wish hits, good luck seeing those characters again for a long time, outside of the Archons maybe. All this said, my point is, Theater also tests one other thing. That's veterancy, where veterancy simply means time on the game. Arguably, a free-to-play or low spender who joined in the 2.x era probably has better odds at theater coverage than a freshly joined moderate spender since like mid-Natlin. And that's it. That's what theater is truly about. In a nutshell, the balanced coverage and veterancy test. Coverage because horizontal test is vague. When people call it a horizontal investment test, they usually just reduce it to you want as many characters as possible. Which is true, but it neglects that balance in elements, weapon types, application, and team roles play a key part. Going back to the 13-13-4 versus 10-10-10 example. Same horizontal spread, but completely different viabilities. Putting it all together, Theater is not just testing how many characters you have on your account, it's testing how long you've been here and what your spread itself looks like beyond just the elements. Abyss wants you to pass their singular test by making teams as you see fit. As a result, there's no difficulty selection, as passing the test with your team building prowess is itself the test. Theater, by contrast, wants to remove that agency from you and ask, what happens if we mix all your stuff up together? You can select difficulties as a result, as the question isn't about whether or not you can pass a singular test, but rather how balanced is your account. Different difficulties allow players to explore that answer, and participation itself is part of the theater test, hence the very first test players go through. The test of how many characters do you even have. We'll put you in one of these tiers and start you there. These angles are also why Abyss allows collection of stars outside of the initial run, and why Theater demands Stella Flowers to be earned in a single run. Again, Abyss is testing team building, so if you need to go back in and restructure, all is fine. They want to know, do you have the smarts and wherewithal to achieve that mop-up clear? If you can, fine. They aren't trying to lock you into a single team to get max marks, they just want to know, can you build teams? Contrast to that, Theater wants to know if they threw everything in a blender, could you make do? Therefore, allowing you to grab Miss Stella Flowers in subsequent runs would be antithetical. They don't want to know if you can get it right with mixing the blender until the stars align and you have the perfect team for your missed stage. They want to know if they mix it up completely, is your coverage good enough all in one go to get max marks from start to finish? At the point you could just retry until the blender aligns for one stage, they would no longer be testing your coverage in the same way. That would just be testing your team building prowess with extra RNG steps. In their practice, real coverage shines through when you have very little control over the situation and still manage to do so, a concept that further separates the player agency test from the balanced coverage and veterancy test. So we've gone through a lot, but there is one more mode to cover before we put the big picture together. Stygian Onslaught is the hardest mode to pin down, as there are a lot of levers to the mode and people consider it to be several things on top of that. But I think two of the most overarching labels the mode receives are that it's a mode for sweaty players, and at its highest echelons is a whales mode. Honestly, I don't think either of these are wrong, but similar to Abyss and Theater, I do think those takes alone ignore some things. Once again, a little bit reductive. Most similar to Theater in that regard is the fact that Stygian does have different tiers of difficulty, rather than a single barrier of entry, with the lowest tiers being so easy that newer players can even compete. I believe this alone kind of dampens the notion that Stygian Onslaught is a mode for sweats and whales, as it certainly invites almost anyone to participate to some degree. It's just a mode where sweats and whales get the most mileage. They can put their skills and accounts to the ultimate test, but players of all levels participate. I just look at players on my friends list. I have no one who has completed Dire on my list even once. Most are silver and gold tier, and there's a handful who consistently complete Fearless like I do. Everyone gets something out of it, even if it's just a few primogems or whatever, and it's that angle I approach this subject with. Abyss and Theater are framed on what they're testing from players, but Stygian is usually framed by who can compete at its highest levels. A mode for sweaty players or a whales mode. It's interesting because we don't say Abyss is a heavy team investors mode, nor do we say Theater is a frequent pullers mode, framing them by who can compete in them. We call them vertical and horizontal investment tests. Well, I did label Theater as a veterans mode, but that's post-analysis, you get my point. It's easy to say Stygian Onslaught is a mode for sweaty players and whales, but that's 1. Not giving any visibility to the overwhelming majority of players who participate in the mode who aren't at the highest levels, and 2. Not answering what the mode even tests. It's like if you said League of Legends is a game for esports level players because Challenger tier exists, ignoring that the majority of players aren't Challenger, and then not even bothering to identify what the large majority even gets out of the game. So what are some levers in Stygian Onslaught we can use to better frame what it's testing, rather than who fares the best? We just mentioned one lever. It does have selectable tiers of difficulty, with these tiers having different rules themselves. As well, the mode is phased, with an opening outbreak phase and a lingering phase where you can continually challenge it. As well, in its easiest difficulties, it allows for co-op to get rewards, and allows repeat characters across the battles, but in the harder difficulties, rewards can only be gained by clearing solo, and characters are not allowed to appear more than once across all challenges. Weapon and gear changes are outlawed as well. There's also leaderboard placements in this mode, a shared time across stages, and exalted characters, but there's another lever that's not explicitly stated, and that's the lean towards recency. Almost every version of Stygian Onslaught has had a battle which shields a recently released character, mechanic, or both. Remember when I said I didn't actually think it's wrong to call Stygian a mode for sweats and whales, but I just think it's reductive? This is why I don't think it's wrong per se. The mode does favor recency, in at minimum 1 out of the 3 challenges, but often more than one. I won't go as far as saying you need every recent character to do well in Stygian Onslaught. For example, I don't have Flynn's as of this recording, but I was able to manage recent Fearless clears all the same. Yet I will say having other recent characters has helped me tremendously, be them Anefa, Lauma, Nefer, Aino, Escoffier, Skirk, any Natlin character really. Total recency isn't necessary, but a good amount is. We're leaving the realm of explicit rules here and dipping into anecdotes and personal observations, but if we're to accept experiences as assigning meaning to gameplay, which I believe we should in this instance since we brought up the discussion of what players get out of the mode, then Stygian Onslaught has a recency lean to it that goes beyond that of Abyss and Theater. Abyss and Theater certainly can lean towards recency, but I've gotten max marks on Abyss before completely ignoring whatever shield of the month it's leaning towards. Same goes for Theater. Stygian Onslaught is a little different. Yes, if we're to acknowledge anecdotes, then we must acknowledge that there are some special players out there who have completely ignored recency in Stygian Onslaught. But I do believe it's fair to say overall that having an up-to-date roster is the best shot at competing in this mode for 90% of players, even low to moderately spending ones. An observation that on its own tells a story, but is exacerbated by the tedious rules laid out in each fight. The specific elemental reaction causes a negative effect, or the enemy's defenses are reduced under these very particular conditions, or Night Soul causes this special thing to happen. To the extent such conditions may exist in either Abyss or Theater, they serve as augments or hindrances that make players that much stronger or weaker, but at the end of the day, those modes still are what they are at their core. In Stygian, challenges are actively built around such specificity, and when you add that specificity to the recency lane, it's no wonder the mode gets written off as Dolphin and Whale mode, as keeping up with all the newest components in the game needed to cover all the new mechanics is daunting without spending something. Unless a player is just really lucky back to back on pools. When you put these ideas together though, a clearer picture begins to form. The recency favoring, the phase timing, the character and mechanical shielding, boss and stage mechanics and modifiers, tiered rewards, leaderboards, single-use characters in their higher echelons. The slippery nature of Stygian's identity is because all these levers are actually testing two things. And no, I don't mean it's just a vertical test like Abyss or a roster spread like Theater. It's a dual test of a different kind, meant to test the two C's of player engagement. Stygian Onslaught is Genshin Impact's consistency and conditional adaptation test. That duality is why Stygian comes off as a sweaty mode or a mode for whales at the highest levels, but remains accessible at the lower ones. Once we examine the tiered difficulty levers, we can see how it plays into both ideas of consistency and conditionals. From difficulties 1 through 3, consistency is nearly trivial. You can nearly pick what you want and just brute force your way through, but the test is still there in that it's asking if you can reliably clear basic conditions with what you have. And on that front, conditions are minimal. Character choice is flexible, you can even reuse them if you like at that level. This is where it becomes true that all participants can get something out of the mode and test themselves to some degree. Even newer players may find some challenge here to overcome and claim rewards for doing so. It's easy as a long-time player to mark them off as trivial tiers, but they are in actuality benchmark tests for someone. Moving on though, the middle tiers of difficulty 4 and 5, Menacing and Fearless, test consistency and conditionals to a stronger degree. You have to exhibit consistently good gameplay across 3 completely unique teams, no character repeats, and unlike Abyss, you can't start a new run with a new lineup for a mop-up clear, as the stage timer will reset with any roster changes. Conditional levers also start mattering more, with boss mechanics and reactionary aftermath forcing situational adaptation, rather than simply suggesting it. This is even the case between difficulties 4 and 5, where bosses can have entirely new mechanics and behavior in Fearless that are not even present in Menacing. Ignoring some conditions greatly increases failure, to the point that not fulfilling some certain battle objectives can result in an unconditional one-shot for whatever character is on the screen at that time. Recency lean also comes into play more, with some stages having conditions directly countered by recent characters or mechanics, testing not only player consistency in gameplay, but player consistency in pulling and keeping current. By the time you reach difficulty 6, Dire Mode, all of these concepts are dialed up to 11. So much so that it does become reasonable to consider whaling, or at least some kind of spending, to be both a test of consistency and a conditional test. Did you see how that flips now? We're no longer framing the highest echelon based on who can participate in it, but rather what test they have to pass to get there. And that test is the player's wallet. It's very likely that recently spending is another lever, emphasis on recently. But if you remove that lever, you'll likely find menacing or fearless to be more realistic benchmarks. Either way, it's a conditional test of recency coverage. That's the point. As for shared time between stages and leaderboard placements, from a consistency angle, shared time means your performances across all stages must be consistently strong. Conditionally speaking, leaderboards add pressure. Not just clearing, but clearing quickly. This plays off of consistency as a competitive metric. Just as another anecdote here, but I have a certain subgroup of friends on the game who have all completed Fearless every time, just as I have. I don't think anyone wants to appear slack to their friends. Their timings push me to improve my own, and also ensure a Fearless clear at minimum every time. Also, regarding the outbreak phase, from the consistency angle, it's a burst test. Can you consistently beat these challenges over the outbreak period to earn a commendation reward? Are you even consistent enough to get on and spend enough resin during that time? Logging on and being able to dump in this mode itself becomes a test of consistency, and from a conditional angle, you have a very short few days to learn some kind of viable strategy for at least one of the fights. Of course, you could always downgrade a tier or two if you don't want to be sweaty in that time period, just to ensure you get commendation rewards. But that said, that's exactly why I reasoned it's not exclusively a test for sweaty players and whales. You're only asked to consistently participate, but you do have a choice of at least what tier you want to bother with. You just don't have any choice of the conditionals themselves. If it calls for lunar reactions, if it calls for shields, if it calls for whatever condition, 90% of players probably better try to satisfy that condition to some degree if playing at their own tier level, whatever that tier level may be. Which, back on the subject of tiers, the reward tiers themselves also enforce the idea of Stygian Onslaught being the consistency and conditional adaptation test, with tiers 1 through 3 giving Primogems, aligning as a test that all can complete. Tiers 4 through 5 give Dust of Enlightenment feathers, progression-oriented rewards which appeal to that mid-tier player that is deep into account growth. It signifies a transition from casual consistency to deeper conditional adaptation. Tier 6, however, offers temporary cosmetics, which don't affect gameplay but signal mastery of extreme consistency and conditionals. Some have asked before why the cosmetics are only temporary, but even that in itself begins to make sense when you remember the framing that it's going for: consistency. They want you to consistently be able to earn it over and over, even if one of the levers that makes that more likely is spending. If one of your account factors isn't strong enough, then too bad. You can't have the cosmetic this time around. Maybe next time. Stygian Onslaught makes a lot more sense when you realize that whaling is only one lever to satisfy the consistency and conditional adaptation test at the highest echelon. But the truth is that every tier, easiest to hardest, is testing players' consistency and ability to adapt to conditions. It may be easy for veterans and frequent spenders to write off the lower tiers as trivial and only focus on what the highest tier is asking out of players. But it's important to remember that even those are benchmark consistency tests for someone. At the upper end though, the recency lane, where account consistency meets conditional mechanics, turns spending into another lever. And at dire difficulty, it's blatant to the point participating seems unimaginable otherwise. Stepping back though, we can see that it's just one lever out of several in an overall much larger test, and one which allows opting in at one's own comfort level. Anyone who plays Stygian consistently and adapts to the conditions of their tier can get the majority of Primogem rewards, the Commendation Feather, and extra artifacts as well. And the overwhelming majority of people who play the mode do, and they ain't playing at dire difficulty. Consistent engagement, consistent performance and clears, consistent recency, conditional adaptation, conditional character choices. That's why Stygian Onslaught is Genshin Impact's consistency and conditional adaptation test. Together, Abyss, Theater, and Stygian aren't just separate modes, they're three pillars of in-game design. But in what ways is there overlap between any of the modes, and what would it imply for the overlapping modes as well as the oddball out? As well, how does it all relate back to gameplay and player audiences? Mechanically, each mode has its own concrete distinction. Abyss offers no difficulty changer but allows mop-up runs. Theater removes direct character selection and locks you into its minimized roster. Stygian blends phases, leaderboards, and artifact farming into its tiered progression. Those are just some of many concrete differences, but here are some observational, though somewhat subjective ones, starting with Abyss. Collectors might do well in Theater or Stygian due to Theater's design encouraging overall collection, and Stygian's lean towards recent character collection. Moderately built characters who fit the mold in those modes will serve you well. Theater doesn't demand perfection, and even a modestly built Anefa or Llama will serve a player well in Stygian if a condition is lunar reactions. Abyss, by contrast, isn't as focused on long-term or recent collection though. Abyss is more of a mode for mainers, those who have really invested in characters and teams they love, be them recent or aging. There are degrees to this, and in recent times, even Abyss floors have favored recency as a bonus. But it's still much more flexible than Theater's demand for a wide spread or Stygian's demand to cover explicit conditions. By comparison, having favorite highly invested teams and characters is a much bigger plus here than in the other two more dictatorial modes. Mainers are definitely more comfortable in Abyss. That's speaking for Abyss though. What of Theater? A freshly joined moderate spender might do well in Abyss or Stygian due to Abyss's team building aspect and Stygian's lean towards recency. For instance, someone who joined mid-Natlan and collected the likes of Mavuika, Shalonin, Escoffier, and Skirk, they has an Anefa, Flynn's, Llama, Nefer, etc., or at least some combination of these. These are team components that would serve Abyss's team building aspect well, and they have the recency to keep up with Stygian's contemporary nature. Yet, being a relatively new player from around mid-Natlan, they probably still don't have the veterancy for the higher tiers of Theater, where simply having strong teams or recent mechanics isn't enough. A wide roster is necessary. Fair enough, a spender will reach the highest levels of Theater faster than a non-spender, but as releases and reruns are still gated by patch lengths, they'll find a better home in Abyss and Stygian until reaching sufficient veterancy. Veterans are more comfortable in Theater. And as far as Stygian goes, as previously stated, it certainly caters more to those keeping up with the game. A heavily investing player could probably leave for a couple of months or a few months, and come back with some expectation to do well in Abyss and Theater. But missing even a couple of months of character releases and recent mechanics may make Stygian Onslaught extremely difficult on return due to falling out of recency. You don't have to get every new character, but you certainly want a few, especially with mechanics like Bond of Life, Night Soul, and Lunar reactions being directly tied into stage conditions, let alone elemental conditions, weapon application conditions, and etc. Due to the nature of how acquiring characters work, the higher tiers of Stygian also favors spenders, but spending or not, relative recency is the key. If Abyss is for mainers and Theater is for veterans, then it's fair to say Stygian is for the consistently active player, the modern player, the contemporary. and being a spender helps. The takeaway here is that whether we're talking about mainers, veterans, or consistent players, what each mode is testing reflects the base it's testing. Abyss, aka the player agency test. Forget how wide your account is or how recent you are, how well do you invest in what you choose? Having a wide account or keeping up with the newest character alone won't save you here. Theater, aka the balanced coverage and veterancy test. Forget what you want to invest in, max investment, recent consistency, or even your current willingness to spend. How well covered are you with what we choose? Only veterancy will aid you here. Stygian, aka the consistency and conditional adaptation test. Forget your favorite team, forget your overall quantity. Are you prepared to face specific conditions? Have you been playing the game the past year? Having a couple of personal favorite teams or even a strongly vertically invested team may help, but that alone won't cut it here, nor will having a wide account. From conditional mechanics to the recency lean itself, are you consistent on Genshin Impact? Perhaps the reason some players feel like the modes are just different presentations of the same horse crap sandwich is because some of those areas where concepts overlap. Theater curates the roster, but you do have full roster selection in Abyss and Stygian, even if Stygian is more restrictive in practice. Abyss has no difficulty modifier, but Theater and Stygian do, which suggests them as personal benchmark tests rather than developer dictated. Stygian only offers long conditional battles of consistency through boss type engagement, but Abyss and Theater incorporate wave stages as well, adding chaotic and frenetic battles to the mix. Whatever mode is or is not doing something special isn't what's in question here. It's the two that share the inverse of that special thing. Since you can select from full roster in Abyss and Stygian, the act of character selection in either mode is a samey process. Since you can select from several tiers of difficulty in Theater and Stygian, there's a samey opt-in feeling. Abyss and Theater do make use of waves rather than bosses, so there's a samey feel to some of those battles. You can point to any lever and make similar arguments. Just go back to Abyss allowing mop-up runs with roster changes for max marks, while Theater and Stygian require unique runs and restrictions on changes respectively. It creates a samey, you must do this perfectly with no mop-up feeling in Theater and Stygian. But what's really happening is Abyss is the unique one. Roster flexibility in Abyss is every bit as defining as roster restrictions are in Theater and Stygian. Modes sharing some overlap doesn't mean they are testing the same thing. You can point to things that two modes or even all three modes do similarly, but it's the degree of variance which makes them different. For instance, I think it's fair to say that even Abyss and Theater test some degree of recency. Floor 12 Abyss, Stage 10 Theater, at least in recent times, they have somewhat shield for the newest character or mechanic of the month. The difference is, it's a fleeting moment in those modes and can be overcome with enough team building, coverage, or veterancy. Stygian, by contrast, is built around account consistency and recency. What's an adjustable lever in those modes is the actual test in this mode. And the same can go otherwise. Having wide coverage and veterancy is the test in Theater, but it certainly aids in Abyss and Stygian as well. It's not that it doesn't come into play in every mode, but it's not the focal point of the others. Lastly, the concept of overlap even extends to gameplay itself. Genshin Impact is, after all, a video game. And at the end of the day, whether you're being tested on your team building, your veterancy, account coverage, your consistency, conditional adaptation, or your recency, when it comes to playing the game, it's still all done the same way. 4 characters, 3 abilities and passives, reactions, it's all the same. A team that works well in one mode might work just as well in another, with the only difference being the circumstances that led the player to choose that team across multiple modes. But maybe that's where the disconnect comes from. When solely framing the endgame modes as gameplay tests, then sure, all the modes can come off as samey. You mean I used Shinhua Farina, Escoffier, and Skirk in all 3 in-game modes? Yeah, same horse crap, different toppings. But no, since playing the game is the active part, it's just easy to misinterpret gameplay itself as being the test. When you do that, then all modes come off as mirrors of one another since the game is universally played the same without levers. But when you understand that the in-game modes aren't just testing gameplay and knowledge, but to a higher degree are testing different levers of account status as well, suddenly overlapping teams and gameplay become more forgivable. Teams are shoes, and if the shoe fits, wear it. If you've come this far and made it to the end, then I'd like to thank you for hearing me out. As my first drop of 2026, I'm planning for even more this year. This video itself began as a response to a comment calling Abyss, Theater, and Stygian the same horse crap, different topics. So I wanted to show why each mode is distinct, even if they share mechanics. If you feel it brought you insight or value, please feel free to subscribe, drop a like, or leave a comment. I do welcome all replies, those that agree, those that disagree, and otherwise. And hey, who knows, if I see a comment I find interesting enough, I might just do a video on that too. That's all for me. P-Squeak 2 signing out.